Sure, a lot of you have seen the new Netflix movie that just came out not too long ago, Killers of the Flower Moon, directed by Martin Scorsese, with an all-star cast like Leonardo DiCaprio, Lily Gladstone, Robert De Niro, Brendan Fraser, and Jesse Plemons, just to name a few. And it's really going over what happened to the Osage Native Americans during the Reign of Terror in the 1920s. And the movie did a good job of depicting it, but I think the true story was a lot darker. And let's dive into it. The Reign of Terror that overtook the Osage Reservation in 1921 is just one chapter in the long history of mistreatment of Native Americans by whites, but it is certainly one of the most horrifying. Before the chapter ends, untold dozens of Osage tribal members and those who dared to support them are murdered. Many are poisoned, others are blown up as they sleep in their homes, shot in the head, thrown off moving trains, or killed in other gruesome ways, and it was all for money. In the end, there would be a series of trials from 1926 to 1929. Some of the murderers will pay a price for their evil, but many others will escape prosecution altogether. As was so often the case for Native Americans, the Osage were forced to give up their ancestral lands between the Missouri and Arkansas rivers. First, they were moved to a reservation in Kansas. Then the Osage in 1870 sold their Kansas lands for $1.25 an acre to settlers and were driven to land in northeastern Oklahoma that until 1866 had belonged to the Cherokee. This reservation included all of Osage County, about 1.5 million acres. Unsurprisingly, the reservation land in Oklahoma is hilly, thickly wooded in places, and was deemed at the time largely unsuitable for most agricultural purposes. But not for all purposes. Oil was discovered on the Osage Reservation, and lots of oil. And the Osage Act of 1906 had given each of the 2,229 members of the tribe head rights for money received for the production of oil on reservation land. As the oil production boomed, the Osage became rich. Net per capita distribution of funds from oil rose from $221 in 1915 to $12,400 in 1923. That would be roughly comparable to $200,000 today. The enormous wealth of the Osage attracted criminal elements and unscrupulous traders and business people. The notorious Al Spencer gang of bank robbers hid out in Osage County. Gangs of bootleggers operated a privately owned power plant and used the county as a distribution center. Dozens of bank and train robbers even held a convention of sorts in Osage County in the freewheeling 1920s. But the biggest game around was taking money from the wealthy Osage by overcharging them for goods and services, by fraud, or by murders that might enable the murderers to acquire money through insurance, especially for those whites who had married into Indian families, allowing them to gain greater shares of the valuable head rights. We will never know exactly how many Osage died for their money. Osage historian Lewis Burns was quoted as saying, "I don't know of a single Osage family that didn't lose at least one family member because of head rights." The killings began in 1921. Charles Whitehorn, a fully blooded Osage, was last seen alive on May 14th. 2 weeks later, his body was discovered on a hill about a mile from downtown Powasca. Whitehorn had been shot twice between the eyes. After Whitehorn's murder, his widow Hattie married a disreputable white man named Leroy Smitherman. Investigators would later conclude that the murder was orchestrated for Charles's valuable head rights by Hattie, Smitherman, and a boarding house operator in Powasca named Minnie Savage, but no one would ever be prosecuted. Hattie told an investigating agent, "If I tell you what happened, you will send me to the electric chair." and so she said nothing and escaped punishment, like most of the Osage murderers. While the murder of Charles Whitehorn was not prosecuted, this account today, brilliantly brought together by Professor Douglas O. Linder of the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law, will focus on the murders that did result in prosecution. 5 murders in particular: the May 22nd, 1921 shooting of Anna Brown, the February 6, 1923 shooting of Henry Roan, and the March 10, 1923 explosion that took the lives of Bill and Rita Smith, as well as their servant Nettie Brookshire. Now, if you like this story and want me to produce more, please make sure that you like and subscribe to these videos. Thank you. It's your support that allows me to do this. Anna Brown, age 34, was a registered member of the Osage tribe and one of 4 daughters of Lizzie Q. Her sister Minnie had died 3 years earlier of what doctors called a peculiar wasting illness. Minnie was only 27 years old when she died and had been in excellent health until the onset of her confounding disease. Anna was the wildest of the 3 sisters. She had divorced her husband, Oda Brown, and taken to drinking, dancing, and carousing with friends until the sun rose. According to her servants, Anna had very loose morals with white men. On May 21st, 1923, Anna, at the urging of her younger sister Molly, came to Grey Horse to take care of her bedridden mother. But Anna was drunk on bootleg whiskey and things did not go well. After she sobered up a bit and had a bite to eat, Brian Burkhart, the younger brother of Molly's husband Ernest, offered to drop Anna off at her home. Anna said her goodbyes to Molly and her family and headed out the door with Brian. It was the last time Molly ever saw her sister. A week later, a boy who was squirrel hunting near a ravine north of the town of Fairfax found a rotting corpse. The gold fillings and the blanket meant it had to be the body of Anna Brown. 2 local doctors, James and David Schoon, performed an autopsy. The autopsy revealed Anna had been dead for about a week and that she had been shot in the head with a .32 caliber bullet. At the time, Molly thought she had a powerful ally in support for her quest for justice for the murder of her sister, Anna. This man was known as William Hale. Hale was the uncle of her husband Ernest and his brother Brian. He was known as King of the Osage Hills. Hale was a wealthy, powerful, and well-connected man. He was a neat dresser with a ruddy complexion and a self-confident and military air. He signed his letters Reverend W.K. Hale and called himself a true friend of the Osage. He donated money to schools and hospitals, acted as a deputy sheriff in Fairfax, owned 45,000 acres of prime grazing land, and recited poetry. He controlled the Fairfax Bank and owned a stable of fine horses. Hale told Molly that he would help her find Anna's killer. He described Anna as a mighty good friend. The coroner's inquest into Anna's murder provided very few answers. Brian Burkhart told inquest jurors that he had dropped Anna off at her house on the day of her murder around 5 or 4:30 and never saw her afterwards. Some suspected that Anna's murderer came from off the reservation, while others considered her ex-husband, Oda Brown, to be the prime suspect. But prosecutors had very little solid evidence. Molly's family even offered a $2,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Anna's killer, but still no one stepped forward. Hale also promised his own reward, both for the killer of Anna and the killer of Charles Whitehorn, being quoted as saying, "We've got to stop this bloody business." Meanwhile, Lizzie got weaker and weaker from what many assumed to be the same strange wasting disease that claimed the life of her daughter Minnie. Lizzie died in July. Molly's brother-in-law, Bill Smith, suspected that Lizzie's death had nothing to do with the peculiar disease. He believed that she was poisoned, and that Lizzie's death, as well as Minnie's and Anna's, had a lot to do with the valuable headright in Osage oil that her family claimed. No one could buy or sell headrights, but they could certainly be inherited. As detectives continued their investigations, other Osage members died under suspicious circumstances. William's stepson, a 21-year-old champion steer roper, fell into convulsions and suffocated, both classic indications of strychnine poisoning. A month later, an Osage woman died of what was also believed to be a poisoning. In August 1922, Barney McBride, a wealthy oilman trusted by the Osage, traveled to Washington, D.C. to urge a federal investigation of the string of murders in Oklahoma. After an evening playing billiards in the Capitol, McBride stepped outside the club, where someone tied a burlap sack around his head and then stabbed him over 20 times. McBride's murder attracted national attention. A headline in the Washington Post stated that what was becoming obvious to many in Oklahoma, a conspiracy believed to kill rich Indians, was happening in Oklahoma. In February 1923, two men out hunting spotted a car down a steep slope northwest of the town of Fairfax, Oklahoma. The hunters reported their discovery to local authorities, who found in the car the body of a man slumped behind the steering wheel. He had been shot in the back of the head. The victim was 40-year-old Henry Roan. Roan was married and the father of 2 children. J. Edgar Hoover later described Roan as a picturesque, full-blood Osage Indian, 6 feet tall and a fine-looking specimen. Bill Hale, of course, was one of the first to be told by authorities of Roan's murder. The mayor of Fairfax said Roan considered W.K. Hale his best friend. At Roan's well-attended funeral, where Osage elders sang their traditional death songs, Hale served as a pallbearer. Only a couple weeks before Roan's murder, Hale had visited Roan and attempted to help him deal with his recent discovery that his wife was having an affair with a man named Roy Bunch. Could Bunch have been the murderer? Hale suggested that he should at least be considered a suspect. Hale, meanwhile, had to be thinking about the $25,000 he would soon receive, having been listed as Roan's beneficiary on his life insurance policy. With Roan's death, the level of fear among the Osage reached new heights. They lighted their homes against the darkness and wondered who would be next. Among the worried were Bill and Rita Smith, who decided to leave their isolated home in the country in favor of the relative safety of a new home in Fairfax. Like many Osage, the Smiths kept a dog as a measure of protection. But in March of 1923, dogs around their neighborhood began to die, poisoned. Bill Smith had been one of the most outspoken Osage in demanding that murderers be tracked down. When he appeared before the tribal council to call for justice, some Osage suggested that an evil spirit was stalking their community. "No," said Smith, "there is no evil spirit except the one in human form." When some in the crowd asked him to name the murderer, Smith remained silent. To name one of the killer or the killer would be a virtual death sentence. On March 9th, after checking out an investigative lead into Roan's murder with a friend, Bill Smith drove his Studebaker back to his home in Fairfax. His wife Rita was waiting for him. Their white servant, 17-year-old Nettie Brookshire, was also spending the night at the Smith home. At 2:50 in the morning, a loud explosion blew the Smith home to smithereens. Rita and Nettie died almost instantly, but miraculously, Bill Smith managed to survive for several days, even though burned almost beyond recognition. Hovering near death, Smith would cry out, "They got Rita, and now it looks like they've got me." After the Smith murders, the tribal chieftain said, "We must appeal to the white father in Washington. Our people, once peaceful and happy, are afraid for their lives. No one knows when he will be called to the happy hunting grounds." The tribal council adopted a resolution asking the Honorable Secretary of the Interior be requested to obtain the services of the Department of Justice in capturing and prosecuting the murderers of the members of the Osage tribe. The explosion lent even more urgency to the search to find the killers, but many Osage saw corruption everywhere and didn't know who to trust. One local government attorney and former prosecutor, W.V. Vaughn, tried as best as he could to solve the crimes. In June 1923, Vaughn received word that an Osage member named George Bighart had information about the murders, but was dying of a suspected poisoning in an Oklahoma City hospital. The only person Bighart would share his information with was Vaughn. He trusted no one else. So Vaughn rushed to Oklahoma City to meet with Bighart. After Bighart died in his company, Vaughn phoned the sheriff of Osage County to report that he had new, critically important information about the series of Osage killings and that he was leaving on the first train. 36 hours later, Vaughn's body was discovered lying near railroad tracks north of Oklahoma City. He had been stripped, his neck broken, and thrown off the train. In the summer of 1925, the new boss man at the Bureau of Investigation, later to be known as the FBI, 30-year-old J. Edgar Hoover, summoned Tom White, head of the Bureau's Houston office, to Washington. White had a reputation for competence and straight shooting, and Hoover had an important job for him. He asked him to direct the Bureau's investigation, which had begun in 1923, into the Osage murders. Hoover called the situation acute and delicate. The job meant moving his family to Oklahoma City to head up the field office there, and would, given recent history, put him at significant personal risk of death or injury. But White told Hoover, "I am human enough and ambitious enough to want the job." When White took over the investigation, he poured through countless records on the case. Agents had concentrated on the cases they considered most likely to be solved and prosecuted, specifically the bombing deaths of Bill and Rita Smith and their servant, and the shootings of Henry Roan, Anna Brown, and Charles Whitehorn. The investigation had been difficult. As might be expected, anyone who knew anything was reluctant to talk, fearing they might be the killer's next victim. With the exception of White, almost all agents operated undercover as insurance salesmen, a medicine man, a cattleman, a prospector. In a 1953 history of the Osage murder cases, the Bureau describes the general class of the citizenry in the territory as very low. The rich oil fields produce not only an abundance of oil, but graft, easy money, gambling, prostitution, whiskey, and parasites bent on milking the Indian out of all he owned. According to the FBI report, Osage distrust of whites was almost universal, and agents had to rebuild their confidence in law enforcement. The first significant break in the Anna Brown case came when an elderly farmer told agents he had seen Anna on the night of her murder. She was sitting inside a car that stopped by a hotel in Ralston. She said hello to someone in his group. The farmer's wife added critical information. The man driving the car was none other than Brian Burkhart. When they pulled away from the curb, she said Burkhart headed straight west from there. Agents knew that Burkhart had said he had dropped Anna off at her home around 5 or 4:30 and never saw her after that alive. If the farm couple was right, then Burkhart was lying. Gathering information from other sources, the agents began to create a timeline that put Burkhart and Anna and an unidentified third man at a speakeasy until about 1 a.m. Another witness reported seeing Brian shouting at Anna around 3 a.m., saying, "Stop your foolishness, Annie, and get into this car." Brian Burkhart was not seen again until about sunrise, when he finally returned home. Another break in the investigation came when a private eye, supposedly hired by W.K. Hale, found himself arrested for robbery in Tulsa. The private eye revealed to agents that he had actually been hired by Hale to shape an alibi by producing witnesses to lie. He offered another useful piece of information. He said that when he met with Hale and Brian Burkhart to discuss this Muddying the Waters campaign, Ernest Burkhart was often present as well. Tom White interviewed people who had also been in the hospital room with Bill Smith in the 4 days before he died of injuries from the explosion. No one he talked to said Smith actually named his murderers, but Smith's lawyer reported that Smith had told him, as Smith lay in his hospital bed, "You know, I only had 2 enemies in the world, Hale and Ernest Burkhart." In addition, Smith's nurse revealed that she had been visited by Hale and that Hale asked her whether Smith had named his likely killers. White would go on to discover a $25,000 insurance policy held by Hale for Henry Roan's life. This emerged as a possible key clue to the murder, because the policy provided an obvious motive. An insurance salesman told agents that Hale's story that Roan insisted on making Hale, a close friend, his beneficiary was not true. In fact, the salesman said Hale had asked for the policy. "Hell's bells, that's just like spearing fish in a keg," Hale had told him. Further investigation revealed that Hale had to shop around for a doctor who would approve Roan for the policy. Many doctors would balk at approving a man with a history of heavy drinking and a prior driving accident while intoxicated, but Dr. James Schoen was willing to authorize the medical approval. White found another interesting connection between Hale and Roan. Hale had previously attempted to purchase Roan's headright, but the transaction never occurred after an expected change in the law allowing such sales failed to pass. White also began to piece together a thread linking the Brown and Smith murders, with Anna, unwed and without children, being the first victim. Her headright passed to her still living mother, Lizzie. Then Lizzie's death, probably through poisoning, meant that her headright passed to her 2 surviving daughters, Rita and Molly. If Rita and Bill were to be killed simultaneously, as they almost were in the explosion, the headrights for them would pass entirely to the last remaining sister, Molly. And Molly, of course, was married to Ernest Burkhart, Hale's nephew. White wondered whether Ernest's marriage to Molly in 1919 might actually have been the first step in a long and murderous plot. An informer told White the name of the suit man, the explosive expert who designed the bomb that blew up the Smith house. The man's name was Asa Kirby, but Kirby was dead, and it seemed Kirby's death was also Hale's doing, another potential witness disposed of. Kirby had been killed when he attempted to rob diamonds from a jewelry store. The shopkeeper had been informed by William Hale about the planned robbery and was waiting with a shotgun when Kirby showed up. It turned out Hale had even set up the robbery, telling Kirby about the stash of diamonds and suggesting the perfect time to rob them. Not so perfect for Kirby. In the fall of 1925, Molly revealed to a priest that she believed someone was trying to poison her. Molly had been getting injections of what she assumed was insulin from the Schoen brothers, but her condition was worsening, not improving. White and other agents found her illness to be very suspicious and arranged to have her taken to a hospital for treatment. Once she was no longer receiving insulin injections from the brothers, her condition improved remarkably. An agent report stated, "It is an established fact that when she was removed from the control of Hale and Burkhart, she immediately regained her health." Asked later about the injections he administered to Molly, James Schoen was evasive. "Weren't you giving her insulin?" a prosecutor asked. "I may have been," Schoen answered. Molly's illness, fear, and impatience in the Osage community and other factors convinced the Department of Justice that it was time to act. Warrants for the arrest of Hale and Ernest Burkhart for the murders of Bill and Rita Smith and Nettie Brookshire were issued on January 4, 1926. On his way to jail in Guthrie, Oklahoma, Hale refused the opportunity to make a statement to the press about his case other than to say, "I'll not try my case in the newspapers, but in the courts of this country." In Guthrie, White and Agent Frank Smith questioned Burkhart, hoping to secure a confession. They brought to Guthrie an incarcerated outlaw named Blackie Thompson. Thompson told Burkhart that he had revealed to agents that Burkhart had asked him to kill Bill Smith in return for a new automobile. Later that night, Burkhart decided to talk. Burkhart said he initially objected to the plan to blow up the Smith home, but he said he relied on Uncle Bill's judgment, and Hale pointed out that his wife would get the additional money from the inherited head rights. Burkhart said he tried to get Blackie Thompson to do the job, but when he wouldn't do it, Hale turned to Asa Kirby. "AC wouldn't do it, that's what Hale told me." Burkhart said that shortly before Hale left for Texas, he told him to deliver a message to a thief and bootlegger named John Ramsey. The message was that the time had come to pull off the Smith job. As soon as the blast went off, Burkhart said, "I knew what it was." Burkhart also identified Ramsey as the triggerman in the Henry Roan murder. After Burkhart's confession, White sent orders to agents to pick up Ramsey and to take him into custody. When Ramsey was shown Burkhart's signed statement, he said, "I guess it's my neck now. Get your pencils." In his confession, Ramsey admitted to killing Roan. "A little job Hale wanted done," he said, as he described drinking whiskey with Roan on the running board of his car. "Then, when the Indian got in his car to leave, I shot him in the back of the head." Ramsey seemed to think of Indians as less than fully human. He told the agents, "White people in Oklahoma thought no more of killing an Indian than they did in 1724. Burkhart, in his statement, refused to implicate his brother Brian in the murder of Anna Brown, but he did identify the third man that had been seen with Anna shortly before her murder. The man turned out to be a person the agents had enlisted to help them in getting to the bottom of the very murder he participated in, Kelsey Morrison. Morrison, according to Burkhart, was Anna's killer. Authorities had yet one more person to bring in for questioning. Finally, White decided it was time to talk to Hale. White told Hale, "We have unquestioned signed statements implicating you as the principal in the Henry Roan and Smith family murders. We have evidence to convict you." Hale replied, "I'll fight it." And he likely thought he would win that fight. He had money and he had influence. The Department of Justice was well aware of Hale's influence and understood that convicting him in state court would be extremely difficult, so they examined the various murders to see if there might be the basis for a prosecution in federal court rather than state court. Crimes committed on Indian territory provided a basis for federal jurisdiction. On the other hand, crimes committed on lands sold to whites or that were otherwise not under tribal control could only be prosecuted in state court. The Roan case seemed the most promising for federal jurisdiction, as Roan's murder occurred on what was still Osage allotment. Charges against Hale and Ramsey for the murder of Henry Roan were brought in federal district court in Oklahoma. The prosecution team included U.S. Attorney Roy St. Louis and John Leahy, a lawyer hired by the Osage Tribal Council. Tom White later described Leahy as a man of splendid character and one of the best attorneys in the state of Oklahoma. Grand jury proceedings began in early January 1926. The New York Times reported, "Seldom in the long history of the white man's dubious dealings with the Indians has there been such a determined combination of craft and violence as that described by witnesses before the grand jury." The evidence convinced the grand jury to issue the requested indictments. Hale's chosen lawyer to represent John Ramsey, Jim Springer, who was a local attorney with a reputation for playing fast and loose, wasted no time in getting his clients to recant his confession. "I never killed anyone," Ramsey now declared. Beginning with the grand jury proceedings in January 1926, Springer would even try every trick in the book. He and his associates enlisted witnesses to lie, intoxicated witnesses who might incriminate their clients to reduce the value of their testimony, threatened potential hostile witnesses, bribed jurors, and made outrageous claims that had no basis in fact. Springer claimed, for example, that the statements signed by Buckhart and Ramsey were made only after being subjected to torture by federal agents. The tactics would so infuriate White and J. Edgar Hoover as to cause them to pressure the Department of Justice to prosecute Springer as well as defense witnesses who committed perjury. An FBI account of these cases stated, "Hale's lawyers employed every device, legal and illegal, to obtain their clients' freedom." The biggest threat to Hale, as he saw it, was Ernest Burkhart. With justification, Burkhart feared for his life. On January 20th, Burkhart told White that he felt he would soon be bumped off, and White arranged for Burkhart to be transported out of state and guarded until trial. He was registered in hotels under an alias. In a letter to Hoover, White said that while every precaution is being taken, he worried that someone hired by Hale might slip poison to Burkhart. On March 1st, prosecutors received bad news. The trial judge ruled that an Osage allotment is not the same as tribal land, and that the murder trial would have to proceed, if at all, in state court. The federal government immediately announced its intent to appeal the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court. Meanwhile, however, to prevent Hale and Ramsey from fleeing any prosecution, they arranged for the men's arrest on state murder charges. Getting a jury to convict in Osage County would be next to impossible, but they had no other option. The preliminary hearing on March 12th in Powasca was a spectacle. Seldom, if ever, has such a crowd been gathered in a courtroom before, reported the Tulsa Tribune. The crowd included well-groomed businessmen and society women, as well as cowboys in broad-brimmed hats and Osage chiefs in beaded garb. Molly Burkhart was there. So was Hale's wife. Things went fairly predictable until the afternoon session when Ernest Burkhart took the stand. One of Hale's lawyers rose and asked permission to meet privately with Burkhart on the ground that he had not been advised of his rights. "This man is my client," he insisted. Asked by the judge if the attorney's assertion were true, Burkhart said, "He's not my attorney, but I'm willing to talk to him." To the dismay of prosecutors, Burkhart stepped down from the witness stand and trotted to the judge's chambers to meet with Hale's lawyers. 20 minutes later, Hale's attorney, Sergeant Freeling, emerged from the room to ask the court to give Burkhart the rest of the day to meet with the defense. The judge agreed. When Burkhart showed up the next morning in court, he took the stand again, but as a witness for the defense, not the state. Burkhart, contradicting his January statement, testified that he never discussed the murder of Roan with Hale. Hale looked on, grinning, as Burkhart recanted line after line of his statement. The trial of Ernest Burkhart for his role in the bombing of the Smith house began in May. Burkhart was tried in state court in Powasco specifically for the murder of Bill Smith. Attorneys for Hale were anxious to secure acquittal for Ernest because they knew that if convicted, he would likely testify for the prosecution in the Roan case. The defense produced testimony to show that the confessions of Ramsey and Burkhart were coerced. None of it was true, but no matter. It was dramatic stuff. Hale testified that a federal agent cocked a pistol behind his head. As he turned around to see it, Agent Smith jumped across the room, grabbed me by my shoulder, and shoved a big gun in my face. He also claimed that Tom White told him, "We will have you put in the hot chair." Then he testified, agents pushed him into a chair, put a black hood over his head, and then attached a device that looked like a catcher's mask to his head. They talked about putting the juice to me. One agent sniffed and exclaimed, "Don't you smell that human flesh burning?" Testimony like that gets attention. The Washington Post and other national newspapers ran stories about the alleged shocking treatment of a prisoner by federal agents. When J. Edgar Hoover demanded an explanation from Tom White, White wrote back to call Hale's story a fabrication from start to finish. In the courtroom, defense attorneys and prosecutors shouted at each other, with one prosecutor threatening to meet a defense attorney out in the courtyard. The court excluded from evidence Burkhart's confession, made in Guthrie in January, but not based on Hale and Ramsey's story of torture. The judge said he thought Hale and Ramsey's allegations were implausible. Nonetheless, Burkhart made his statement in the early morning hours after a long period of detention, and this, the judge ruled, was enough reason to exclude it. But the prosecutor had one key card in the Burkhart trial, and his name was Kelsey Morrison. On May 18th in Guthrie, Morrison had confessed to his role in Anna Brown's murder. Morrison stated that he and Brian Burkhart got Anna drunk and then drove her to a place about 3 miles from Fairfax. He said he took Anna about 40 steps down a ravine and gave her a big drink and left her. 2 or 3 hours later, he shot Anna with a gun furnished by Hale. Anna fell back down without a sound. Hale paid him, he stated, $1,600 for the job. Morrison also had much to say about the explosion at the Smith home. He stated Hale had approached him any number of times about shooting Bill Smith and his wife at his home at night, but that he had refused. He said that killing the Smiths would make Molly heir to their estate, and then Ernest Burkhart would make it right with me. The triple murders could have added about $150,000 to the estate of Ernest Burkhart's family. According to Tom White, who attended the trial, Burkhart seemed to be very restless and nervous throughout. On June 8th, after his trial had been interrupted by the sudden death of his and Molly's 4-year-old daughter, Ernest Burkhart passed a note to a deputy sheriff who was escorting him from the courtroom back to jail. The note indicated that Burkhart wished to meet with prosecutor John Leahy. When the two men met in Burkhart's cell, Burkhart said he was through lying and didn't want to go on with this trial any longer. He couldn't tell his own lawyer. Hale might have him killed. When Burkhart next appeared in court, he walked straight to the judge, said something to him, then announced to a stunned defense team and a courtroom full of spectators, "I wish to discharge the defense attorneys. Mr. Flint Moss will now represent me." Moss then said, "Mr. Burkhart wishes to withdraw his plea of not guilty and enter a plea of guilty." Burkhart read a statement indicating that he had delivered the message from Hale to his suit man, Asa Kirby, telling him the time had come to blow up the Smith house. "I feel in my heart that I did it because I was requested to do it by Hale, who is my uncle." Burkhart also admitted that the allegation of physical abuse by federal agents was a lie. The only duress, he said, was being questioned for long hours into the night. On June 21, 1926, Burkhart was sentenced to life in prison. By May, the Supreme Court had ruled that the Hale-Ramsey trial for the murder of Henry Roan could take place in a federal court after all. On July 26, 1926, the brick courthouse in Guthrie, the trial opened with prosecution witnesses under heavy guard. The prosecution knew it faced a challenge in finding 12 untainted jurors, and they asked each potential juror during voir dire whether they had been approached by anyone interested in obtaining a particular verdict. Each swore that they had not, but the prosecutors had another concern. The victim was a Native American, and many white Oklahomans, in the view of one Osage, considered the murder of an Indian as a crime on par with cruelty to animals. Ernest Burkhart was the prosecution's star witness. After his guilty plea, with tears in his eyes, he had told White he would from then on tell the truth in any courtroom, regardless of the consequences. Burkhart told jurors that Hale's original plan to kill Roan was to use poison moonshine, a method he had employed before with success. In the years of the Reign of Terror, more Osage were poisoned than killed by all other methods. He testified that Hale became upset when he found out that Ramsey had shot Roan through the back of the head and taken the gun. Ramsey was supposed to have shot Roan through the front of the head, then left the gun by his side to make the death appear to be a suicide. If he'd only followed instructions, Hale had said, nobody would have known. Bootlegger Matt Williams testified that Hale revealed to him in January 1923 that he had taken out a $25,000 life insurance policy on Henry Roan with the Denver Insurance Company. Hale said that he had lent Roan some cattle and would make it look like the policy was security for the cattle deal. He added that he had made arrangements with John Ramsey to bump Roan off. 3 days after Roan's murder, Williams testified he met with John Ramsey, who told him he shot Roan after luring him with whiskey. Interestingly, Williams said that Hale was already thinking about legal strategy. He told Williams that he had talked to his lawyers about whether pulling off jobs on Indian lands would allow federal prosecutions, and that his lawyer had assured him that the government had no jurisdiction. Dick Gregg, a member of the notorious Al Spencer gang of bank robbers, testified that Hale had unsuccessfully tried to hire him to murder Osage members. O.C. Webb testified that before the Roan murder, he heard Hale tell Ramsey, "We are ready to go. Everything is ready to go." After Hale was arrested and concerned about what Webb knew, he said to Webb, "I want you to stand pat, old boy. I'll depend on you." Other witness testimony focused on Hale's policy on the life of Roan. An insurance examiner testified that when he asked Hale if he was planning to kill that Indian for his insurance, Hale answered, "Oh God, I am. Hell yes." When the defense had its turn, Hale testified, "I never devised a scheme to have Roan killed. I never desired his death. The defense also called to the stand a number of witnesses who either corroborated alibis for Hale or Ramsey or tried to shift blame to Roy Bunch, who had been having an affair with Roan's wife, or to an outlaw named Curly Johnson, who was deceased at this time. Much of the testimony was perjured, bought and paid for by Hale. Typical was the testimony provided by Buster Jarrett, residing in a Powasca jail on a bank robbery charge at the time of the trial. He testified that he saw Roy Bunch pay Curly Johnson for killing Roan. Jarrett later would confess that he was persuaded to give his perjured testimony during a 90-minute jail cell visit from Hale's attorney. Hale's attorney promised to snatch him out of prison if he testified as asked. In his closing argument, prosecutor Roy St. Louis told jurors that the evidence proved that the richest tribe of Indians on the globe has become the illegitimate prey of white men. And the worst predator of all has been the defendant, the ruthless freebooter of death. The jury deliberated for 5 days but could not reach a verdict. St. Louis announced in court that he knew the reason why. At least one, and possibly more, jurors had been bribed. Later, it was revealed that the jury stood 6-6 on the issue of guilt. There would be another trial. The retrial began on October 20th in Oklahoma City. The prosecution's witness list for the retrial was similar to the first trial, but the examination of witnesses was tighter and more focused. The defense made an effort to pin the blame for the Roan murder on Ernest Burkhart. Burkhart conceded that he had pled guilty to murdering his wife's sister, her husband, and their servant. Rattling off the list of Molly's murdered and possibly murdered relatives, Hale's attorney asked, "Has your wife now any surviving relatives outside of the 2 children she has by you?" "She has not," Burkhart answered. After a day of deliberations, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict. When the clerk read the verdict, Hale and Ramsey appeared stunned. Guilty. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The vote on the first ballot had been unanimous. The 2 men were sentenced to prison for the period of their natural lives. Hale and Ramsey were sent to Leavenworth, Kansas to serve their sentences. Just months later, the 2 men would meet the newly appointed warden, Tom White. In 1927, Kelsey Morrison faced trial for the murder of Anna Brown. Morrison had recanted his confession, and even, as discovered from a letter sent to Hale and seized by prison authorities, threatened to burn down authorities if I ever get the chance. Morrison promised his old friend, Hale, that if called as a witness in his trial, I won't forget you, and I will be there with bells on. Brian Burkhart, who had previously been acquitted in his own state court trial for the murder of Anna Brown, had immunity and testified for the prosecution. So did Morrison's former wife, Catherine Cole. Cole testified that she saw Morrison and Brian Burkhart walk a very drunk Anna Brown from their car to a ravine. I realized they were going to do something to Anna Brown, and it scared me very much. I was afraid to say anything to Kelsey for fear that he would do something to me. They returned, she testified, about a half hour later without Anna. Later that night, when she asked Kelsey about what happened, Kelsey cursed me and told me to keep my mouth shut. Catherine Cole was right to worry. Another witness, Dewey Self, testified that Kelsey asked him to get shut of Catherine, essentially kill Catherine, because she knew too much about the Anna Brown murder deal. Later, Self met with Hale to discuss plans to murder Cole, plans which were never executed. Matt Williams, a bootlegger, testified that he saw Burkhart on the night Brown was killed. Burkhart told him he had to take care of some business for Uncle Bill that night, and that Kelsey Morrison was going to meet them at the Arkansas River Bridge. 3 or 4 days later, Williams said he met Morrison, who told him that Hale had him do the worst job he ever pulled, and that now Hale was refusing to pay him what he'd promised for killing Anna. In Morrison's telling of the murder, William said he knocked Anna from behind while Brian Burkhart was loving Anna, and then carried her from the car where he shot her in the head. The jury found Morrison guilty. Yet the trials were still not over. Hale and Ramsey appealed their convictions. The Eighth Circuit concluded that the trial took place in the wrong court. Hale and Ramsey were tried in federal court for the Western District of Oklahoma, where they should have been tried in federal court for the Northern District of Oklahoma, where the crime allegedly occurred. Hale and Ramsey asked the court that their trials be severed. They were tried separately. Hale was convicted in January 1929, and Ramsey was convicted 10 months later. The trials were finally over. The murders, for the most part, stopped. But that did not mean every murderer had been brought to justice. David Grann, author of the best-selling book about the Osage Reign of Terror, Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI, notes that the series of murders in the 1920s still ravages generations of Osage. He quotes a great-grandson of Henry Roan who says that the murderers are still in the back of our minds. You just have it in the back of your head that you don't trust anybody. Grant devotes a chapter of his book to describing his efforts to identify some of the killers who escaped justice. One likely killer identified by Grant was a bank president and intimate associate of Hale named Herbert G. Burt. Burt made a fortune lending money to the Osage at astronomical interest rates. Grant makes a convincing case that Burt had a strong financial motive and was behind both the poisoning of George Bighart and the murder of attorney W. W. Vaughn, who was thrown off a moving train after meeting with Bighart as a part of his investigation into the Reign of Terror murders. Grant also re-examined evidence relating to the Charles Whitehorn murder. He concluded that the evidence suggested 3 people, including Whitehorn's half-white, half-Cheyenne wife, Hattie Whitehorn, and 2 other co-conspirators who were responsible for the murder. The FBI initially looked at the evidence in the Whitehorn case but dropped it, Grant writes, because it did not fit into the Bureau's dramatic theory of murders, that a lone mastermind, Hale, was responsible for all the killings. Grant draws an important lesson from the Whitehorn case. The evil of Hale was not an anomaly. Far from the Bureau's official estimate of 24 murders, Grant notes that scholars and investigators now believe that the Osage death toll was in the scores, if not the hundreds. Most of the victims might as well have died through hard-to-detect poisons, including the injection of massive amounts of morphine into already drunk Osage members. The resulting deaths in almost all such cases would be reported simply as deaths from alcohol poisoning. The list of murderers and the web of silent conspirators who helped them included many of the most powerful whites in Osage County. The list includes bank robbers, doctors, traders, undertakers, lawyers, wealthy ranchers, and even lawmen. Grant quotes Osage leader Bacon Rind, who remarked in 1926, "There are men amongst the whites, honest men, but they are mighty scarce." And what about the main players in the Bureau's drama? Molly divorced Ernest Burkhart during the series of federal trials. She remarried in 1928. In 1931, a court declared a previous order declaring Molly to be incompetent was vacated, and she became free to spend her money as she so wished. Molly died in 1937 at the age of 50. John Ramsey was paroled in 1947. Ernest Burkhart paroled in 1937, but then robbed a bank before being released in 1959. He spent his last years in a trailer home with his brother Brian. William Hale served 21 years in Leavenworth before being paroled in 1947. He spent many of his prison years working on a pig farm. While working as the warden of Leavenworth, Tom White always insisted that Hale be treated just like any other prisoner. Hale never admitted ordering any killings. Before leaving jail, Hale wrote a letter in which he expressed a desire to return to Osage County. "I had rather live at Gray Horse than any place on earth, but it was not to be." As a condition of his parole, he was required to stay outside of the state of Oklahoma. Hale died in a nursing home in Arizona in 1962 and was buried in Wichita, Kansas. The Osage Nation now includes over 10,000 members, though less than half live in Osage County. The boomtowns of the 1920s are all but gone. The gushing oil wells of an earlier day have mostly given way to stripper wells, which generally produce less than 15 gallons a day. About 75% of head rights to oil on the Osage reservations remain in member hands. Today, the Osage seem ready to move on from oil to a greener form of energy. In 2015, a new windmill farm sprang to life in Osage County. The times are changing. Casinos now bring in more money than oil. The Osage wealth allowed the tribe to purchase media mogul Ted Turner's 43,000-acre Blue Stem Ranch in 2016. In Pawaska, Oklahoma, visitors to the Osage Nation Museum, the oldest tribally owned museum in the United States, can explore exhibits on Osage art, culture, and history, including the Reign of Terror. Oh my God, if you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me. Editing is not easy, but I am getting better at it, and I'll try to produce more of these type of things for you guys. If you haven't already done so, make sure you guys like, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on. Signing out.